Welcome back to One on One on 90.7 FM, our first show back on the radio after the hiatus. We have a special guest this evening. It's Jeff Pearlman. He is the 9-time New York Times bestseller author, and he has a new book that's just out. It's called The Three-Ring Circus, Kobe, Shaq, Phil, and the Crazy Years of the Lakers Dynasty. And first of all, Jeff, how are you? And thanks for joining us this evening.
I mean, it's just another day in 2020 in America. It's I feel like I'm living in the weird carnival of the world. So compared to the misery that many others are going through, I'm doing okay. Thank you for asking.
Yes, and luckily we can say the same here. So I want to start right away with the book and this Laker dynasty that you chronicle for readers. And again, the book is out and available. The three guys in the title, Shaq, Kobe, and Phil Jackson, the head coach. Just to start with the obvious, the feuds between the two players, the conciliation that comes later. Tell us about this relationship, this dynamic between three massive figures in the history of the game.
Well, I mean, the one thing they all had in common was talent at what they did, very high-level talent. I think it's funny how we remember, people would look back at Shaq and Kobe and say, man, they didn't get along well, but on the court, they were magical together. And I just don't agree with that. They didn't get along well together. And I don't think their games actually meshed that well. I think what it was is they were just so supremely gifted and so, it's not like when you watch like old tapes of John Stockton and Karl Malone and they're doing the pick and roll nonstop and it's beautiful. We watch Klay Thompson and Steph Curry and they're kind of playing off each other and you just see them setting each other up. Like Shaq and Kobe weren't like that. Kobe was an amazingly gifted player who could create his own shot. Shaq was the most physically dominant player of his generation and one of the most physically dominant of all time. And they were just really good. And off the court, I always say like Kobe Bryant gets married not far from where I live here in Dana Point, California. And not only does he invite none of his teammates, most of them don't know he's getting married. Most of them don't even know he's dating someone. Like it's not even a criticism of him. He did not view that as a role for him. Like I'm not here to be buddies with everyone. It's not some movie. We don't need to go out afterwards and have, kimchi. Like that's not why this exists. Like I'm here to play basketball. And Shaq, on the other hand, he wanted to be loved and he wanted to embrace you and he wanted to go out to dinner with you. And none of that, he wanted to take you out for dinner and he wanted to buy you your first suit. He wanted to fly your family in for your first game as an NBA player. He had this desire to share love, to be loved. And I think a lot of the strain in that relationship came because Kobe didn't need it. And Shaq needed to give it. And Shaq needed to feel it. But Kobe didn't give a crap about it. So I think that's it. And really when Phil Jackson came in back in 99, I think his main job in a lot of ways was to be the sort of overseer of it all, which is to say he wasn't going to intervene every day and tell these guys, you need to behave better. This is terrible. He wasn't in the locker room every day yelling at them. But he relied on a lot of veterans, like Rick Foxes and Robert Ory's, to sort of sheriff the locker room. And if there were problems, let him know, and then he would intervene.
Jeff, it's interesting you bring up Kobe not needing that, adulation or mentorship, whatever it may be. And it's interesting because when you think about how that team came together, right, Shaq comes in from the Magic in 96. Kobe is traded for in the draft by the Lakers after being taken by the Charlotte Hornets. Was that the dynamic between those two right off the jump? Because the entire sense that I've gotten around that dynasty is that those two were butting heads pretty much the entire time they were there. Was it something that developed pretty much, right away from when Kobe was drafted and Shaq was signed, or did it kind of fester over time and reach a crescendo as their two careers developed towards stardom?
So I feel like it was mostly two coworkers who didn't have that much in common away from the office. And we all have that.
Yeah.
So that was a big part of it. I mean, Kobe showed up in 96 at barely 18 years old. And in his first introductory team meeting where everyone is going around introducing themselves, hey, I'm Nick Van Exel. Hey, I'm Shaq. Hey, I'm Eddie Jones. Hey, I'm Kobe Bryant. I'm from Lower Merion High School, and nobody here is going to punk me. That was what he said in his first introduction. That's a fart in the room kind of introduction. That's a terrible way to introduce yourself. And it did not go over well. And before long, he's like, he's obviously physically gifted, but all he wants to do is ridiculous sort of drives to the hoop. He's not looking left. He's not looking right. He never passes. Shaq gives him the nickname Showboat, not as a compliment. So they had some really heated moments in their relationship. A lot of it was based on this frustration of Kobe not willing to pass the ball. Shaq not improving as a free throw shooter, and that driving Kobe crazy. You know, like, they're just the two alphas. Think about when Phil Jackson coached Michael Jordan with the Bulls. Michael Jordan was always the number one. It was always Michael. Scottie Pippen was great, but he was number two. There was no doubt about it. And with the Lakers, you have these two guys who both think they need to be up here, and it matters to them. Like, it actually matters to them. Status of it matters to them. And it was really hard it was just hard. They both thought they deserved what the other was getting.
To rewind a little bit on Kobe Bryant, and he grows up in Italy, and I'm so curious about that and his time there and how it sets him apart. And then the other thing that I think sets Kobe Bryant apart is that he is this hard worker. There's so many young basketball players who look at Kobe Bryant and they look at the effort that he put into his game, and that's the kind of thing that a kid who might be undersized, not that Kobe was, but might look at that scrappiness and try to embody it, try to emulate it. But what about those two things, him growing up in Italy and being the best player on the court there, and him being unique in that part of his game, that drive part of his game?
I think it's a very unique thing to, number one, grow up outside your country where you develop this bond with your own family, a really tight bond with your own family, because you don't really fit in. You're one of the few black faces in a world that's not black at all when you're living in Italy and you're growing up in that era. And you're always sort of special. You're always this prodigy of basketball. You know, your goal is to make the NBA. Your dad played in the NBA. Your uncle played in the NBA. And I think what happened to Kobe, even when he moved back to Lower Merion, he's in this mostly white suburbs, and he shows up and he's this great basketball player. And again, he's the son of a former Sixer. I don't think he ever developed really good conversational skills and interpersonal skills. And I would say it's funny, like, he looked really cool. Like, he looked cool. He was a Laker. He was in the uniform. He's a good-looking guy. He had a cool haircut. Like, everything about him looked really cool. But he was sort of a geek. Like, he was sort of, to use an old word, like, he was awkward and clumsy and didn't get the rhythms of a conversation, didn't understand that it's okay to joke with your teammates. And maybe sometimes, even if you don't want to, you should go out with them for dinner just because that's what you do. It builds his trust. And I just think a lot, I mean, he went to prom with the singer Brandy, you know, on an arranged date. He didn't even know her. His press conference announcing he was going to the NBA was attended by the members of Boyz II Men. Just like, he didn't grow up in a normal world. And people always envy fame, you know, that we always look at young stars and we, you know, this is going to sound like Demi Lovato or a Britney Spears or a Kobe Bryant or, you know, any of these Disney stars. Like, you look at these people, Justin Bieber, and you think, oh man, they're so cool and blah, blah. And like, I've interviewed a lot of people who are child stars. They tend to be really awkward and really clumsy, and they never asked someone out to the prom. They never got rejected asking someone out for the prom. They never failed their driving test. Oftentimes they never took their driving test. They weren't punished for drinking beers in the backyard. You know, like, they missed so many developmental steps that are really, really important that seem boring at the time, but you actually need them. I just think Kobe Bryant missed a ton of those important developmental steps.
Jeff, we've spent a lot of time talking about Kobe and Shaq. The third ring of this circus, as your book describes, is Phil Jackson, who was the legendary Bulls coach, came over to the Lakers in 1999, and after 2004, actually briefly stepped away from the Lakers, eventually finds his way back. There was obviously a lot of infighting between Kobe and Shaq. That's obviously well documented in the book. How much did that, in addition to wearing away at the Lakers dynasty, how much did that also wear on Phil, having to come in virtually every day and have to manage something between these two otherworldly talents?
I think Kobe really beat him down. I mean, I know Kobe really beat him down. Like, people always compare Jordan, what was it like coaching Jordan, to what was it like coaching Kobe. And the thing is, when he started with the triangle in Jordan, I mean, Jordan was resistant at first, but he basically was in on the idea that this is what I need to do to win. Okay, I'll do it. And he bought into Phil Jackson very quickly. Kobe bought into Phil Jackson quickly when he arrived because Kobe wanted to be Jordan. And here's the guy who brought Jordan. But as the time went on, Kobe just really started not paying attention to the triangle. He started, he had a lot of, we all remember him as a great player because he was a great player. There were a lot of 7 for 26 shooting nights for Kobe Bryant, like a lot. And those used to drive not just Phil Jackson crazy, but his teammates crazy because they would be wide open. And the thing that really would get bad, they would play, let's say Vince Carter in Toronto was coming to town. Like teammates were always like, oh, this is going to be awful because he's just going to want to go right at Vince Carter. And he would. He'd go right at Vince Carter and the game would come down to this really stupid battle between Vince Carter and Kobe Bryant. So you're Phil Jackson, you have this system in place and you know it works and you won 6 rings using this system, the triangle offense. And you have the guy who invented the triangle offense, Tex Winter, sitting literally right next to you on the bench. And you have this guard who refuses to adhere to it. And then because of that, you have Rick Fox standing here bored, Robert Horry standing here bored, Derek Fisher here standing bored, Shaq frustrated as all hell in the middle. So it was a constant battle for Phil just to get Kobe to stick with it. And the last season in particular, 03-04, was kind of a nightmare where Kobe was just done with it. Kobe was done with Shaq. He wasn't listening anymore. So I wouldn't say I don't think I think ultimately Phil really enjoyed coaching Shaquille O'Neal. Most people enjoy coaching Shaquille O'Neal, but Kobe was difficult.
Good teams, great teams often have these stories, and we saw it with the Bulls in The Last Dance, and you also wrote about it with the 1986 Mets, though in very different ways in your book, The Bad Guys Won. And our listenership, of course, being New York based, I'm curious your insights about that 1986 team and just in your deep dive, looking at a team that in New York, people still talk about. It's a team that just will always go down in history, not only for their win and how they won, but who they were and how that clubhouse was made up.
I'm going to take a wild stab that you guys were not alive in 1986.
That would be right. But,
it would be
but
correct, yes.
But my dad is an enormous Met fan, so I've got all the stories.
You missed something. Like it was, I was just a kid, but it was, I think what was cool about it, it was like very grimy New York City at the time. Like now you're in New York City. If you make the mistake, you go into Times Square, it's all, neon and blah, blah, blah. And back then, I'm not saying it was better, but it was basically like peep shows and hookers on corners and where can you buy your drugs and a lot of graffiti. And the 86 Mets really reflected that. Like they were gritty and grimy and disgusting and gross. And they were hanging out at the bar. Finn McCool was getting wasted and they were staying after games and tapping a keg together. It just felt very, very organic. There was a very organic feeling going on back then. You had this homegrown guy in Dwight Gooden who was just this phenomenon, Darryl Strawberry phenomenon. They were just a bunch of badasses. Like that's what made them great. They were people would say like every now and then, can you compare the 86 Mets to the Shaq Kobe Lakers? No, you cannot. Like it's like comparing like sewage to caviar. Like they were sewage. Like they were sewage, but they were our sewage. They played in this dump stadium, Shea Stadium, and there was a cracked end of a stadium, and but they were just the best. I mean, they represented New York better than any team I've ever seen. The 86 Mets. You missed out.
Yeah, I also personally, being a Mets fan, can attest to that. My mom's a big Mets fan. She tells me the stories all the time. In fact, Game 7 of the 86 World Series was supposed to be on her birthday, and then it got rained out, and they played it the next day. But that's neither here nor there. So anyway, Jeff, I wanted to ask you, because you've written a lot of different books, and you were talking about comparing the Shaq Kobe Lakers to, say, the 86 Mets, which you can't do because nothing really compares to the 86 Mets. But you've written a lot of other biographies about teams, about individual players. You've written about Barry Bonds. You wrote about the 90s Cowboys. This project in particular, this most recent book about the Lakers, how does it compare to some of the other long-form, book projects that you've worked on over the years, obviously being a prolific author as you are?
It was probably the hardest.
Really?
Yeah. As you get into more modern times, athletes become a little more difficult because they've been coddled much more than older athletes. Older athletes, they didn't make as much money. They didn't have handlers around them. They didn't have a plexiglass shield placed around them, via publicists and whoever, agents. So these guys, it's harder to crack through. Like, you have to work a lot harder to crack through to these guys. Also, obviously, I wrote a book here, and then I'm done with the book. And I'm sitting in a coffee shop one day, and I get a text saying that Kobe Bryant died. So I've never had an experience like this, where one of the major protagonists in your book dies between the time you wrote it and the time it comes out. I mean, that's confusing and weird and off-putting, and you worry a lot that people are going to think you're just some guy capitalizing on someone's death and you wrote some quick rush book about Kobe Bryant. So it's been, in that way, it's been the weirdest experience I've had, where it's just not, I was trying to find other examples of people who have had this happen. I couldn't even think of anyone. Authors who wrote a book and the main protagonist in the book dies, and then after you finish the book. So it's been very strange. That's the biggest difference by far, because I've never had that happen.
One of your books that I find to be relevant at this time is Football for a Buck, The Crazy Rise and the Crazier Demise of the USFL, and the involvement with the sitting president now. What would you tell us about the story of Donald Trump and the USFL?
I was working on that book when he was running. It was pure coincidence. I wanted to write a USFL book for years. I finally got the deal. Donald Trump is running for president. Everything he did in the USFL, he has somehow done as president or while running for president. And the perfect example I'll give you, and I kept saying this while I was working on the book. There used to be a quarterback named Doug Flutie at Boston College who won the Heisman Trophy. And he signs Doug Flutie to the biggest contract in football history for the New Jersey Generals as USFL team. And he tells his other people with the Generals, don't worry, we're signing the contract, but the other owners are going to pay for it. He's going to play for us, but the other owners in the league are going to pay for it. And he sends a letter to the commissioner of the USFL and to the other owners saying, I have given you the gift of Doug Flutie. This is awesome for a league. Now I expect each of you to pay part of his salary. I kept saying to everyone, holy crap, Doug Flutie is the Mexico Wall. Like, he's actually the Mexico Wall. Like, it was the exact same nonsense, 100%.
Wow.
Donald Trump, when he was in the USFL, all he wanted was an NFL franchise. It's the only reason he did this, is he thought getting a USFL team would get him a quick trip to having a team in the NFL. He holds a secret meeting with the commissioner of the NFL, Pete Rozelle. And he says to him, basically, I'll paraphrase, I will throw the USFL under the bus if you can get me an NFL franchise. I don't care about this league. I want an NFL franchise. You tell me what I have to do to get in the NFL. So when people are like, collude with Russia, he would never collude with Russia. I'm like, he literally went behind the backs of his own league to try to get an NFL team, and was more than happy to throw him under the bus. So it was like one after another. And I kept screaming at people, I'm telling you, this is a con man. This is a con man. Nobody listened.
Well, you've reported on not just him, but so many athletes, from Walter Payton to Brett Favre, most recently now to the Lakers. Your new book is 3 Rings: Circus, Kobe, Shaq, Phil, and the Crazy Years of the Lakers Dynasty. And you can find that in bookstores, online. And Jeff Pearlman, we thank you so much for joining us on One-on-One and taking the time.
Thanks,
Yeah, my
Jeff.
pleasure. Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Good luck.
Thank you.